On May 17, 1861, the California State Assembly was in its last few days in session before breaking for the season. The secession crisis was in full swing on the East Coast, and Lincoln's call for 75,000 volunteers had spooked 4 more slave states into joining the Confederacy. Despite being almost 3,000 miles away across the continent, the national crisis reached the Golden State anyway. In those final days in session, the California State Assembly held a vote on a resolution upholding the Constitution of the United States and that California should stay in the Union. The resolution passed overwhelmingly with 49 votes for and only 12 against. One of the 12 dissenters who voted against staying in the Union was Daniel Showalter, a gold miner by trade and Democrat politician representing Mariposa County, in the heart of the rugged Sierra Nevada. Showalter demanded the right to a brief speech about why he was voting against the resolution, to which Assemblyman Charles Piercy, Democrat from San Bernardino County, objected, since it was a straight yay or nay vote with no speeches. Showalter took offense, and an argument ensued in the chamber, which carried on and escalated over the last few days of the legislative session, with Piercy and Showalter even trading insults on the assembly floor. A few days later, at the close of the legislative session, Piercy challenged Showalter to a duel. The Southern sympathizer agreed, and on May 26th, 3 miles west of San Rafael, the pro-Union Democrat and pro-secession Democrat met on the dueling field and fired their rifles. When the gun smoke cleared, Piercy lay dead and Showalter walked away victorious. But because dueling was illegal in California, the rebel sympathizer was now a fugitive on the run. By May 1861, word had already reached California that the unrecognized Arizona Territory in southern New Mexico had declared secession from the Union just 2 months earlier in March. He was also aware that the Knights of the Golden Circle, a pro-Southern secret society with a paramilitary wing, was giving rebel sympathizers militia training in secret and smuggling people east to fight for the South. Showalter's new plan, now that he was on the run, was for Arizona to be his safe corridor to Texas, where he planned to enlist in the Confederate Army. In the meantime, in order to get there, the fugitive had to find a way to get to Southern California and rendezvous with other rebel sympathizers, looking over his shoulder every step of the way. And so that May, Dan Showalter disappeared for months, but he will come up again in this story. The American Civil War finally reached the Arizona Territory in July 1861. The First Battle of Mesilla was a victory for the 2nd Texas Mounted Rifles and caused the Union garrison from Fort Fillmore to retreat north of the 34th parallel, back to Unionist New Mexico. The Yankees were totally demoralized, and before retreating from Fort Fillmore, they helped themselves to the post's medicinal whiskey supply. Therefore, when the daylight came and turned to a scorching hot desert afternoon, scores of hungover and badly dehydrated Federal stragglers were laid out in the sand for miles, begging the rebels for water. Despite being the numerically smaller force, Baylor's Texas troops cut off the retreating Yankee column and captured the wrecked garrison. There were still Federal Army garrisons and pro-Union militia in New Mexico, that being the northern half that didn't secede, but Arizona was clear of Federal troops. On August 1st, a confident Colonel Baylor, at the peak of his popularity and of his military career, boldly proclaimed the territory of Arizona as part of the Confederate States of America, with himself as military governor. The next day, Baylor put the territory under martial law and included appointments for his new territorial administration. With these 2 moves, Baylor supplanted the sitting civilian governor and his whole cabinet, and eliminated the position of lieutenant governor altogether. Having occupied the de facto territorial capital, Mesilla, Baylor knew quite well that the Provisional Government existed and had been there for over a year, since they were the ones who received him with open arms and fanfare. Lieutenant Colonel Baylor's territorial proclamation was literally a military coup for the governorship and the entire territorial government, but it didn't legally count as a coup because the Confederate government did not yet recognize Arizona. Hence, Louis Owings and Ignacio Orrantia were overthrown without a shot fired, and the Constitution of 1860 was null and void. Even the strictly neutral Judge Bull in Mesilla was ousted along with all other county-level officials, and they were replaced with men whom Baylor deemed unquestioningly loyal to the Confederacy. The territorial Arizona Rangers went from being pro-Confederate militia to Confederate militia. The civilian provisional government had been elbowed out, and martial law began. John Robert Baylor was a man who would be a handful for any modern psychotherapist. He grew up as an army brat on various frontier posts in the 1820s and 30s and interacted with Native Americans at an early age. He ran away from home at the age of 13 to fight in the Texas Revolution, but was returned home by concerned adults. He later settled on a northwest Texas frontier at age 18 and joined a volunteer militia to fight the Comanche, who still ruled the lands called North and West Texas on paper, but which the Spanish had fittingly named Comancheria. In the 1850s, Baylor served a stint in the state legislature before serving exactly 1 year as a U.S. Indian agent in North Texas. He was dismissed from this job for his brutality, which says a lot considering that the Indian Wars were still in full swing at the time. After the stint as Indian agent, Baylor got in trouble again for raising a private militia that tried to violently evict natives from their own federally assigned reservation in North Texas, thus forcing the regular army to intervene and stop him. Baylor then tried his hand at a number of side hustles, but he finally disappeared from the Indian Tory after a business competitor ended up dead, with foul play suspected. Baylor then returned to farming in Texas. As a side hustle, he founded a rabidly anti-Native American newspaper he called The White Man, which lobbied for complete extermination of indigenous people in North America, and peaked at over 1,000 readers along the overland stagecoach route. He was a bitter critic of Governor Sam Houston for being what he called too soft on the Indians, and was delighted when the legislature voted to secede from the Union and remove the Unionist Governor Houston from office. Once Texas seceded, Baylor published a newspaper ad looking for 1,000 armed men to join him on a buffalo hunting expedition on the Great Plains. He raised around 300 volunteers, which became the optimistically named 2nd Regiment of Texas Mounted Rifles, that being cavalry, despite only being at battalion strength. Raising these troops got the Indian fighter commissioned as a lieutenant colonel in the Confederate States Army. Baylor brought one of his 7 slaves with him as a body servant for the 2nd Texas Mounted Rifles expedition to the far west. In July 1861, Baylor and his battalion arrived in the self-proclaimed Arizona Territory, which had been self-governing from Tucson and Mesilla for over a year, with a small citizens' army scattered around the vast territory to protect the mines and frontier settlements. During the month of July, both Governor Owings and Lieutenant Colonel Baylor were in Mesilla when Captain Alonzo Ridley and the Los Angeles Mounted Rifles arrived from their dangerous exodus from the West Coast. The LA Mounted Rifles were a rogue company of California state militia that sided with the Confederacy, and more than half of whose members were Los Angeles Sheriff's deputies, Ridley himself being undersheriff before defecting to the South. Less than half of the 80 men in the company made the journey from Los Angeles to San Antonio, but the 32 rebel militiamen successfully absconded with their state-issued weapons and safely escorted across the treacherous North American desert the future Confederate General Lewis Armistead and his son, as well as future rebel General Albert Sidney Johnston and his body servant Randolph Hughes. Mesilla was a stopping point where the California rebels were greeted with a hero's welcome, rested a few days, disbanded as a unit, and then made the last leg of the trip to San Antonio by stagecoach, where they joined the Confederate Army. While in Mesilla, Albert Sidney Johnston even took supreme command of the Arizona Territorial Militia for a few days as a courtesy because Colonel Baylor specifically asked him to. The commander of the now disbanded rebel militia, Alonzo Ridley, followed General Johnston and served as one of his officers in the Western Theater of the War, meaning east of the Mississippi River. But after Johnston's death at the Battle of Shiloh, Ridley would end up a lieutenant colonel in the Arizona Brigade. After the California rebels passed through town, on July 23, 1861, Baylor's battalion took off northbound from Mesilla into the Oregon Mountains. The rebel soldiers captured Major Lind and his 500 federal troops at San Augustine Pass without firing a shot. This is one of the very few times in the Civil War that a smaller force captured a significantly larger force. Most of the rebel soldiers were Texans, but Arizonans were present in the fight. Colonel John Baylor's adjutant, his brother, Major George Baylor, recalled, "One of those who volunteered for the fight was Sherrod Hunter, who was one of the most gallant men in the Confederate Army." Sherrod Hunter was one of the first Anglo-Americans to settle in the Gadsden Purchase lands back in 1857, and made a successful living as a farmer by the Mimbres River near Pinos, Altos. He also became a captain in the territorial militia. After the Apache offensive in the summer of 1861 forced Hunter to abandon his homestead, he joined the 75 Territorial Arizona Rangers, who enlisted in Company A of Colonel Baylor's new Arizona Rangers, which was a Confederate Army unit within the 2nd Texas Mounted Rifles. The victory at Mesilla and the capture of the Federals north of Fort Fillmore made Baylor a hero back east, and effectively shielded him from any flack for going rogue and proclaiming a territory with himself as head of government. Also, after Baylor's coup eliminated the position of lieutenant governor, Ignacio Orrantia disappeared from politics completely until the war was over. Only 4 members of the old provisional government managed to stay in government during the Baylor regime. James A. Lucas kept his job as territorial secretary. The ousted Chief Justice Granville Oury was elected as congressman by a vote of the people according to the Confederate Constitution, much to Baylor's chagrin since the military governor had been secretly lobbying in English and Spanish for people to vote for his own hand-picked candidate. Former Marshal under the Provisional Government, Samuel Bean, was made Justice of the Peace for the 4th Precinct in late 1861, replacing Baylor's first appointee, M.A. Veramendi. Finally, Marcus H. McWillie, a Texas lawyer who moved to Mesilla, was first a late addition to the Owings administration as a district judge, but was then appointed Attorney General of Arizona in the Baylor regime. This had to be a painfully bittersweet moment for Governor Owings. On one hand, he was overthrown from office and humiliated in front of his entire constituency. On the other hand, Arizona was recognized by the Confederate Army, therefore it was only a matter of time before the Confederate Congress ratified it, and the Arizona experiment would survive and continue. The sweetness of the Confederate liberation of Arizona from the Yankees was short-lived before the military government and civilian population were jolted back to reality. Apart from the rebellion against the United States, Arizona was still at war with the Apache Nation. Though the Arizona militia had won a small war against the Membreños in 1860, they had not managed to kill the leader, the legendary Mangas Coloradas, which means colorful sleeves. He could have had this name because he wore a colorful shirt, or he got this name because he got his sleeves dirty with the blood of the Mexicans that he had killed. Making a bad situation worse, the Federals left the rebels a colossal Charlie Foxtrot before pulling out of southern New Mexico. In late January 1861, an unknown Apache band kidnapped a local 12-year-old Mexican-American boy, Felix Ward. Sources disagree on whether it was the Coyotero Apache or the Pinal, but the Chiricahua Apache were wrongly blamed. Second Lieutenant George Bascom, the commandant of Fort Buchanan, young and fresh out of West Point, had the Chiricahua leader Cochise called to a satellite army camp to talk. Cochise came and brought his wife, children, and brother with him as a show of good faith. While talking with Cochise through a Spanish-language interpreter, the Green Lieutenant Bascom made a horrible mistake. He ordered Cochise to remain in Federal Army custody, effectively a hostage, until the Army managed to free the missing boy. The soldiers made a botched attempt to capture Cochise, who cut his way out of the tent where troops were blocking the exit. The Chiricahua chief escaped, but his family was captured, and his brother was one of 6 Apache hostages executed by the cavalry in reprisal. The Bascom affair resulted in open war between the Chiricahua Apache and the Americans, and other Apache bands quickly united behind the Chiricahua. This unified nation resolved to completely reconquer its lands that had been invaded over 2.5 centuries. Then in the spring of 1861, most Federal Army garrisons abandoned the Southwest, leaving behind a disaster for Arizona residents and a time bomb to blindside the Confederate Army. Just days after John Baylor proclaimed himself military governor of Arizona, 300 miles to the west, some 200 Chiricahua-Apache warriors laid siege to the Presidio at Tubac. The defenders were the civilians who lived in the village inside the old fort's walls, including a few local militiamen, and they were badly outnumbered by the attacking force. It's a wonder they even held out as long as they did. The defenders were surrounded for 4 days. That was 4 days of on and off gunfire and fighting off attempts to storm different parts of the Presidio walls. By a stroke of luck, the settlers managed to get one messenger to escape through enemy lines who made it to Tucson. On the fourth and final day of the siege, 25 Arizona militiamen, led by Captain Granville Oury, rode into the village with guns blazing to bust out the villagers. They even had a standard bearer waving the stars and bars from his horse as the troop made a dramatic entrance. Even with the reinforcements, the defenders were outnumbered and couldn't hope to make the Apache retreat, but they broke the siege and successfully evacuated the inhabitants of the village. The refugees and militiamen rode off like lightning to Tucson, leaving Tubac to be burned by the Chiricahua. Some of the survivors from the siege of Tubac left Tucson 2 weeks later bound for Texas and were attacked again, this time by 100 Membreño Apache, who killed 4 settlers in the fighting, wounded several more, and stole 400 cattle and 900 sheep, which was an absurd amount of wealth in the desert frontier. A few days later, Captain Thomas Maston of the Arizona Guards Company led 35 militiamen on a surprise attack in the Florida mountains to take back the 1,300 head of livestock. They left behind 7 dead Apaches, and the militia took no casualties in this engagement. Tucson's local paper, the Weekly Arizonan, reported on August 10th, "The mail is withdrawn, the soldiers are gone, and their garrisons burned to the ground, the miners murdered, and the mines abandoned. The stock raisers and farmers have abandoned their crops and herds to the Indian, and the population generally have fled, panic-struck and naked, in search of refuge. We think no man ever before saw desolation so widespread. From end to end of the territory, except alone in Tucson and its immediate vicinity, there is not a human habitation. In this extremity, our only reliance is in God and ourselves. Pray, boys, but keep your powder dry." The following month, the unified Apache Nation took the offensive farther north and east. On September 2nd, a 4-man squad of Confederate cavalry soldiers from Fort Stanton were on a scouting mission through the Guyanas Mountains when they were ambushed by 30 Mescalero Apache warriors. 3 of the rebel soldiers died in the 2-hour firefight, and the lone survivor, wounded and running low on ammo, escaped on horseback and braved an almost vertical downhill slope to get away from his pursuers. 6 days later, Lieutenant John Pulliam at Fort Stanton received a distress call from the Mexican-Arizonan settlement at El Placito. Lieutenant Pulliam led 15 rebel cavalry soldiers 10 miles south on an emergency mission to break an Apache siege on the settlement. The soldiers and settlers fought through the night before the Apache guerrillas finally quit the siege. 2.5 weeks later, the Apache attacked again. 200 miles east of Tucson and 200 miles south of the Guyanas Mountains, a war party of 300 Chiricahua and Membreño warriors led by Cochise and Mangas Coloradas attacked the mining camps and town of Pinos Altos, the place where Governor Owings was received with honors the year before. Given the size of the attacking force, there is a real possibility that Geronimo participated in this battle, since he was a Chiricahua with military rank, not civilian rank, and he was known to raid with Mangas Coloradas' band, the Chihende. The early morning attack on September 27th caught the town completely by surprise. The first casualties were several miners trapped partially underground in their workstations when the attackers showed up, firing rifles and arrows. Other miners who managed to grab their guns were the first responders to the attack. They held out long enough to give a 15-man squad from the Arizona Guards, led by Captain Thomas Maston, time to rush back to town from their patrol. They were intermittently reinforced by militiamen from Pinos Altos' other company, the Minutemen. The miners and militiamen and the Apache guerrillas fought from medium to long range at first, with the defenders fighting off small waves of skirmishers. Then around noon, the Apache made a full frontal attack on the town, at which the defenders fought hand-to-hand with the attackers for the longest half hour of their lives. Knowing the Arizonans were losing the battle, Captain Maston called for the militia to muster the one cannon in town. The cannon was really for show, and there were no cannonballs, but there was gunpowder and rocks and scrap metal in town. The cannon was then loaded and fired into the mass of attackers, killing several Apache and wounding many more. That was what finally made the Apache siege fall back. In those frantic final minutes of fighting for Pinos Altos, Captain Thomas Maston was mortally wounded. The 22-year-old militia captain and former Attorney General of Arizona had led his troops to an unlikely victory, but he died of wounds a few days later in Pinos Altos, making him the only member of the Provisional Government to die in the service of the Confederate States. The Confederacy's gateway to the Pacific Ocean, coveted by Lieutenant Colonel Baylor and President Jefferson Davis, was temporarily slammed shut by a unified Apache nation, one which didn't care whether the white invaders dressed in blue or gray. The residents of Tucson in western Arizona and Pinos Altos in central Arizona were under siege by a hostile enemy, and they were losing the war. Meanwhile, with over 100 miles shielding them from the nearest Apache, the residents of Mesilla were living in a completely different reality in the east. They held a grand ball to celebrate the Texans' July 25th victory over the Yankees on the battlefield near Mesilla and the follow-up capture of the Federals retreating from Fort Fillmore. The 2nd Texas's regimental band played for the festivities, and according to the Mesilla Times, the champagne and wine flowed freely, and the dancing was kept up until a late hour. Again, these were the twin victories that gave Baylor the confidence to create a new Arizona territory according to his own vision, which he did on August 1st. The following month, the ousted Governor Owings left Arizona to go to Richmond and lobby for governmental recognition and resources for developing his beloved territory. He had no idea as he was leaving that September that he would never return to the territory he co-founded. Although Owings decided to keep quiet for the good of Arizona and the good of the Confederate Army, in which many of his constituents were now serving, Baylor's blatant overthrow of the elected provisional government opened a faction war in Arizona politics. The chief antagonists were Lieutenant Colonel John R. Baylor, military governor, and newsman Robert P. Kelly, co-editor of the Mesilla Times. Both Kelly and Baylor were ardent Confederate patriots, but they severely disliked each other due to differences in opinion on how the territory should be governed. Their personality conflict began with the Times frequently raking the Baylor regime over the coals and Baylor's ego getting bruised, with the grudge kept alive by the newsman's repeated attacks and nursed even further by Baylor's own ego. The personal conflict ended with Baylor shooting Kelly in a street fight in December 1861. Eyewitness accounts agree that Baylor both started and ended the fight. When Robert Kelly was walking down the street in downtown Mesilla and passing Baylor's office, the military governor called out to him from inside, saying, "Hold it right there, my lad. I need to speak with you." He then reached for a musket to use as a club and cheap-shotted Kelly in the face, knocking him to the ground. Though he was down, Kelly reached for a knife. Baylor restrained the struggling newsman with one hand and cocked a pistol with the other. And then Baylor shot Kelly in the side of the head. Kelly died of the wound on January 1st, 1862, and there would be no consequences for his murder. While Baylor was still escalating his feud with Kelly, news of the months earlier victory over the Federals at Mesilla inspired droves of Southerners and rebel sympathizers in California to migrate east across the desert to join the Confederate Army in Texas. In December of 1861, a joint patrol with soldiers from the 1st California Infantry and 1st California Cavalry captured a group of 18 men headed southeast from Warner's Ranch in San Diego County. The travelers were armed with repeating rifles and included one Daniel Showalter, the pro-secession state assemblyman on the run since killing Assemblyman Piercy in a duel. This group of would-be rebels were arrested by the federal patrol and locked up at Fort Yuma until they were released later in the war. Showalter took the oath of allegiance under duress, but the arrest had only hardened his resolve to fight against the United States. Ever the magnet for trouble, rebel sympathizer Dan Showalter will come up once again later in the story. On January 2nd, 1862, with the Confederacy still ascending towards its high water mark, Colonel Baylor embarked on an offensive operation with 550 men to capture a federal garrison from New Mexico that had returned to Cañada Alamosa, inside the borders of the Confederate Arizona Territory. Baylor was shocked to find that the Federals had abandoned the town before his arrival, and he was convinced that treachery had robbed him of his due victory. Even the Mesilla Times commented on January 8th that timely information of this movement must have been conveyed to the enemy from this valley. Less than 3 weeks after the Yankees ghosted Cañada Alamosa, 3 Mexican Arizonans were intercepted by Captain Bethel Copwood of the San Elizario Spy Company, a reconnaissance company from El Paso, Texas, serving in Baylor's Army Command. The 3 travelers were carrying a written message from local citizens Crittenden Marshall and Jake Applezoller, communicating Confederate troop movements to the Union garrison commander at Fort Buchanan. The following day, Marshall and Applezoller were arrested by a squad of Confederate soldiers led by Captain James Henry Tevis, an original Arizona settler and former Arizona Guardsman now serving in Herbert's Battalion of Arizona Cavalry. On January 20th, in front of a guardhouse in the town of Doña Ana, Crittenden Marshall was executed by hanging in front of Applezoller and 3 other prisoners charged with treason against the Confederate States. The deaths of Robert Kelly and Crittenden Marshall, the Arizona Unionist, were a harsh reminder to the public that this territory really was under martial law, and offending the military governor could be deadly. At the same time, the Confederate Congress officially organized Arizona as a territory on January 18, 1862, reconfirming Lieutenant Colonel Baylor as military governor, and the Act of Congress went into effect on February 14th. This was the absolute high point of Baylor's career, since both his territorial coup and victory over the Federals were legitimized in his recognition as Arizona's military governor by the Confederate Congress. However, the absolute control he enjoyed over the government was lost when Jeff Davis formed a new territorial cabinet with his own political appointees, sending most of Baylor's puppet cabinet packing. Baylor's new cabinet included Robert Jocelyn, a Mississippian who'd been working as President Davis's private secretary before being appointed Territorial Secretary of Arizona. Jocelyn won Davis's infamous undying loyalty when the two served together in the Mississippi Rifles in the Mexican War. When not tending to Davis's business and personal affairs, Jocelyn loved to write bad poetry. He had also never actually been to the territory in whose executive cabinet he was appointed to serve. The new Chief Justice for Arizona, Alexander M. Jackson, was the New Mexico territorial legislator who had written New Mexico's draconian slave code in 1859, and it was all too predictable that he defected to the Confederacy 2 years later. Christopher Columbus Upson was a colonel on the staff of General William H.C. Whiting in the Army of Northern Virginia before retiring from the military and being appointed Associate Justice in Arizona. This was another political appointee who'd never been where he was appointed to serve. Marshal Samuel J. Jones was already in Arizona and was one of ex-Governor Owings' business partners before the war. He caught Jeff Davis's eye as the pro-slavery sheriff of Douglas County, Kansas during the sectarian fighting in Bleeding, Kansas. His presence in Arizona when the Civil War began made his appointment a no-brainer for Richmond. One of the last things Baylor did as governor of Arizona was deploy Captain Sherrod Hunter and Company A of the Confederate Army's Arizona Rangers to reinforce Tucson, where the settlers and militia were still barely holding out against the Apache. Hunter and his cavalrymen, most of whom were Arizona settlers before the war, arrived in town on February 28th to the relief of the population. On the next day, March 1st, the rebel soldiers formally raised the Stars and Bars over the town. This was a symbolic gesture that was important for the Confederate Army, but truthfully, the local militia had already flown the Stars and Bars in Tucson numerous times. Still, the locals were glad to have real soldiers reinforce them in the fight for the survival of their frontier town. Then in March, Colonel Baylor left for Texas to recruit more desperately needed troops, leaving behind Colonel William Steele of the 7th Texas Mounted Rifles to run Arizona for him. By the end of the year, Baylor recruited around 1,500 men into 4 cavalry regiments that he collectively designated the Arizona Brigade, for service in Arizona no later than 1863. However, 2 disasters happened for Baylor while he was away from his metaphorical castle. First, after General Henry Sibley's Army of New Mexico began its offensive, officers from Sibley's staff reported Baylor's genocide order to Richmond. This order, which he had only verbally given to his troops, was to lure Apache Indians to military camps for peace talks, then exterminate all the adults, and sell the children into slavery to offset the costs of the campaign. Jefferson Davis was horrified by this and revoked Colonel Baylor's command. That meant he was no longer the military governor of Arizona. This tells us that the faction war in Confederate Arizona's politics wasn't over, but that the anti-Baylor crowd had merely gone underground after Robert Kelly was killed. Although Baylor was booted from command over the Apache Order, he was still commissioned in the Army and still had the task of recruiting 5 regiments for the Army. However, never knowing when to quit, John Baylor published newspaper editorials in Texas, defending and doubling down on his controversial order. Again, Baylor's personal detractors in the Army and the civilian population sent newspaper clippings of the editorials to Richmond. And in the fall of 1862, Baylor was officially kicked out of the Confederate Army. Once Baylor was booted, Davis never saw cause to appoint a replacement governor. To add salt to open wounds, Baylor got to read in the newspapers about how Edward Canby's federal regulars, reinforced by New Mexico and Colorado volunteers, drove Sibley's entire army out of New Mexico and Arizona, including the original battalion Baylor had left behind in Mesilla. The Baylor regime had fallen, but now the Confederacy's hold on Arizona was about to collapse as well. This concludes part 2 of this documentary. While this chapter focused on the Arizona Territory's high points and low points under Confederate administration, the fall of the rebellion in Arizona is its own undeniably fascinating story. In part 3, we'll take a deep dive into the fall of Confederate Arizona and the literal changing of the map during the American Civil War. Thank you for watching the Civil War, Wild West Edition.
Me, mother.